Planting in raised beds is my preferred method of gardening, particularly in the vegetable garden. But when I discuss raised bed gardening and raised beds themselves, what's it all about? Well, join me today as I discuss the basics of raised beds. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and when you think of raised beds, you probably think of something like I'm sitting on, one of these wooden boxes that are raised up and where we grow things like garlic and tomatoes and all the rest of our vegetable garden. But raised beds are much more than just wooden boxes. This ring of stone blocks is a raised bed as well, though it probably doesn't look like a raised bed that you may have seen before. When we discuss raised beds, all we're talking about is a bed for plants that is higher than the surface of the garden as a whole. So this bed might only be 4 inches higher than the surface, but that's enough to make it a raised bed. A raised bed doesn't even need to be constructed out of some building material. This is a raised bed with my goji berries and some strawberries. It's about 6 inches higher than the level of the ground. And as you can see, I just have some tree branches that are defining the area of this raised bed. And you don't even need a border material if you don't want it. This is a raised bed. It sits about 12 inches higher than the ground level. It's a hugelkultur mound with lots of buried logs underneath. And as you can see, there's no clearly defined edging on this bed. I have a raised bed made out of concrete blocks that rises about 8 inches above this surface. And I have metal raised beds. This galvanized steel bed that I constructed is about 20 inches high. And this modular metal raised bed from Forever Garden Beds is about 32 inches high. So as you can see, raised beds can be of just about any material or no border material at all. And the height varies depending on what you want to build and what you're going to use it for. However, these green stock vertical garden towers are not raised beds. This is container gardening. And though this might be tall, don't think of it as a raised bed. Think of it as growing in a container just like you would grow in a pot, a bucket, or a grow bag. While there's no clearly defined definition of raised beds, the material, the height, or the size, I tend to think that raised beds are bigger. It's a larger garden area where we're growing large plants or a number of plants, like all of these beds behind me. They're raised above the soil surface. It's a large area. They're raised beds. These beds I consider to be raised beds as well, though they're the smallest raised beds that I have. And because of their small size, it could be argued that this is container gardening and really not raised bed gardening. I have a couple columnar apples in these large pots. And while these might be trees, I don't think of these as raised beds. This is container gardening. These are just big pots. The other primary type of gardening is in-ground beds. And I do that too. I've got some honeyberries and some grapevines and the little fruit trees behind me that are all being grown in the ground that I did not raise in any way. The in-ground garden beds are often seen as a more traditional way to garden. That's the way that many of our parents or grandparents gardened. It almost seems like the idea for raised beds is relatively recent, though it's been done for hundreds of years. It really comes down to the individual gardener. what the gardener wants to get from a garden bed, and that will help determine the best approach for you. I think there are many benefits to raised beds, though there are some problems with them too. There are two primary reasons why I do most of my vegetable garden in the wooden raised beds and the metal raised beds. As I age, my back just isn't what it used to be. So for me, for mobility issues and for ease of gardening, I find that the raised beds are much easier on my back. And also, I've done a soil test of this entire space, and my soil is very poor. If I were to garden in an in-ground bed, I would have a lot of amending just to get the soil to the point that I could begin growing plants. For the raised beds, once I got the beds constructed, I was able to bring in soil, good soil that was already amended, and I was able to start planting within just a few weeks of filling these beds. I also just like the look of the raised beds. The wooden beds, the metal beds, I like the ability to have clearly defined areas that I can walk between, I can walk around, and most importantly, I don't have to walk on to get to the plants. But to get this look, the wooden beds and metal beds, there is a cost factor associated with them. And depending on how many beds you have and how high they are and what material you're using, they can get expensive. You don't have that issue with in-ground beds, which can be amended and grown in and cost virtually nothing. That was a big factor in my design and planting of this pollinator garden. Most of these are perennial plants. The idea of building or buying individual beds for this area to put perennial flowers in really didn't make much sense, especially since I want a more native and wild landscape. So no raised beds, which means no extra cost. I'll still get a nice look that I'm after, but I don't have to use raised beds to get it. There's also a maintenance component to the raised beds, particularly wooden beds will gradually decay over time, and so those boards are going to need to be replaced. That's one reason why I started shifting to metal in this bed, because I can expect these metal beds to last much longer. But the galvanized steel in particular will begin to degrade over time. That's a big reason why I went with these Forever Garden beds, which have a special coating, also metal, but they should last for decades, or at least as long as I still have time to garden. It's one of those extra activities to have raised beds. You've got to take care of them. An in-ground bed, well, a hoe and a rake is really all you need to do to just replenish it every year before planting. But the raised beds, I think, will also decrease some of the work that you have to do in your garden. I have to protect my plants from insects and weather, and I like using these hoops of all different sizes. Well, having the hoop already sized to the bed and then being able to just pull out the bird netting or the plastic or the row cover or the hail cloth or whatever it is I'm putting on these beds is extremely easy. I don't even need to bend down much. I could use a system like this in an in-ground bed, but the bending and the lifting would be a little more trouble. For me, that's a little bit extra work that I don't have to worry about. And these clearly defined limits of these raised beds makes it very easy for me to plan what plants and how many plants I'm going to be able to put in this bed. It's not as easy in an in-ground bed where you might have a roughly defined pathway between plants. And for a bed like this that's 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, I can access the entire bed from all sides, which means I really can plant all the way up to the edge. That's not as easy to do when you're growing in an in-ground bed where the pathway and where the plants are growing often overlap. But having those pathways in an in-ground bed that are just running in between the plants actually means you can probably grow more plants and maybe have more garden beds in a defined garden space. These raised beds are spaced far enough apart that I can get a wheelbarrow in and I can move my hose around, and I'm losing some growing space in the pathways between the raised beds. Now, it's all part of the design and how close you want the beds to be, because I could have these beds closer. But particularly in small garden spaces, the in-ground beds might be a better option without as much space lost to the pathways. My garden is big enough that I can have both types of beds, like these gooseberries and these currants behind me. These are perennial plants. They're going to get bigger, come back every year, and I can grow them in my native soil. As poor as it is, I just have a lot of mulch and I add some fertilizer to these plants specifically. In my raised garden beds, it's a little more work. I have to amend the soil in those beds twice a year because the vegetables are going to be using a lot more nutrients, and a simple mulch is not enough to keep that soil nice and healthy. Amending a vegetable garden soil is always a good idea. So even if I didn't have raised beds and I was doing in-ground vegetable gardening, I would still be amending my soil. But it's easier when I can stand up and not bend over rather than having to dig down low and deep in an in-ground bed. For me, this is clearly my favorite way of doing it. This is what I've found to be best for the type of gardening that I do. The basics of raised bed gardening, as you can see, has a lot of variation, and it really comes down to the individual gardener. It comes down to you and what you prefer when deciding whether to grow your vegetables or your perennials in any specific type of bed. To see more about raised beds and some of my other thoughts to include the benefits, we'll go ahead and click on one of these videos now. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.